The sound of running water had always been the heartbeat of Liv Wilson's land. Every morning, before the sun lifted itself above the hills, she would step outside barefoot, the cool earth pressing against her soles, and listen to the soft murmur of the creek that wound lazily across the back of her property. It wasn't much, a narrow ribbon of water slipping through reeds and smooth stones, but it had been there for as long as she could remember. Her father used to tell her that the creek had a mind of its own, that it belonged to the land as much as the land belonged to it, and that as long as it kept flowing, life here would never truly dry out. When he died and left her the old house and the few acres surrounding it, Liv made herself a promise. She would keep this place alive, no matter how hard it got. The world outside her valley might have turned fast and merciless, but here, time still moved to the rhythm of water and wind. Liv's days were quiet, filled with small rituals that gave her peace. She painted landscapes in her sunlit studio, often using the creek as her muse, its reflections of sky and willow branches, shifting like brushstrokes of color she could never quite capture. She grew wildflowers along the banks, hung wind chimes from the trees, and left bowls of seed for the birds that came to drink. It was a solitary life, but not a lonely one. She had the land, the rhythm of the seasons, and the memory of her father's voice reminding her that true ownership meant stewardship, not control. The house itself was old, peeling white paint, creaking floors, and the faint scent of cedar that lingered in the walls. But it was home, and she felt safest when surrounded by its imperfections. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. It was late spring, the air thick with pollen and sunlight, and Liv had just finished cleaning her brushes when she noticed the silence. The usual music of the creek, the soft splash, the rustling current, had dulled into a sluggish trickle. She walked down to the water's edge, frowning as she crouched beside the stones. The water was lower than she'd ever seen it, barely covering the roots of the reeds. For a moment, she told herself it was just a dry spell, nothing more than nature shifting its moods, as it often did. But a strange unease tugged at her as she trailed her fingers through the shallow flow. The water was warm, unnaturally so, and it carried a faint metallic scent. Over the next few days, the change became impossible to ignore. The flow slowed further, the once reflective surface breaking into muddy patches that exposed the bed beneath. Dragonflies still darted through the reeds, but the frogs had gone silent. Liv started waking up earlier, checking the creek at dawn, hoping to see it restored, but each morning it looked weaker, as if dying by inches. Her garden began to suffer too. Flowers wilted faster, the soil hardened, and the air grew heavier, dustier. She tried running the pump that drew water from the creek to fill her storage tanks, but it groaned and sputtered, pulling in only air. By the end of the week, the creek was little more than a scar of cracked mud winding across her land. Liv stood there one evening as the sun bled red across the horizon, her arms folded tightly as if she could hold herself together through sheer force. She felt betrayed, by nature, by luck, by whatever quiet balance had once sustained this place. The stillness was oppressive now. Even the wind seemed to avoid her valley. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that this wasn't a natural drought. Something had changed beyond her land, something deliberate. And though she couldn't yet see it, she could feel its hand stealing the water away from her piece by piece. That night, Liv sat by the window of her studio, staring out at the empty creek bed under the pale light of the moon. Her brushes lay untouched, her canvas half finished. She remembered her father's words again. As long as the creek runs, the land will live. The silence outside was his answer. Something, or someone, had taken the heartbeat of her land, and in that silence, a new resolve began to take shape within her. She would find out who had done this, and she would make them give it back. The morning the creek vanished entirely, Liv woke to the hollow sound of wind scraping through dry reeds. The air carried a kind of silence that didn't belong here, an absence so sharp it made her chest ache. She slipped on her boots and walked toward the creek bed, still half expecting to hear the soft burble of water returning after the cool night. But what met her eyes made her stop mid-step. The earth was cracked wide open, deep fissures like veins running through what had once been a living stream. The rocks were caked in dust, the smell of decay hung faintly in the air, and the reflection of the morning sky was gone. It wasn't just dry, it looked dead. She dropped to her knees, pressing her palm against the brittle soil, hoping for a trace of dampness underneath. There was none, only powder, warm from the sun. For hours she wandered along the path of the creek, following its winding course as it cut through the edge of her property and into the trees beyond. Her dog, Rusty, trotted alongside her, whining softly as if sensing her unease. Liv had walked this trail countless times with her father when she was a child, back when the water ran strong and cold, back when her world still felt safe and whole. She knew every bend, every stone, every root that curved over the bank like a hand reaching for the flow. But when she reached the fence marking the boundary of her land, something new stopped her cold. A wide trench had been dug across the old forest path, cutting through the soil like a fresh wound. Heavy tire marks scored the ground, and the metallic scent of fuel hung in the air. The trench led uphill, deeper into the land owned by the Homeowners Association, where the larger properties sat behind iron gates and manicured lawns. Liv's heartbeat quickened as she followed the line of the trench until she reached the top of the slope, where the trees opened up into an estate so large and polished it looked almost unreal. A 2-story mansion stood at the center, its pristine white walls gleaming in the morning light. Workers in neon vests moved around the yard, setting up pipes and hoses that snaked down into the very trench she'd followed. And then she saw it, the water, her water. A steady, glittering stream flowing through the pipes and into a wide, artificial basin that shimmered like a mirror. The basin wasn't just a pond, it was the foundation for an enormous pool, complete with stone tiles and a decorative fountain already being installed at one end. Liv's stomach turned to ice. She climbed a few steps closer, her boots sinking into the churned earth, and saw her neighbor, Marcia Davenport, standing near the pool's edge, wearing sunglasses and a broad hat, gesturing to a contractor as though she were painting some grand masterpiece. Marcia had always carried herself with the unshakable poise of someone who believed rules were made for other people. As president of the HOA, she was used to getting her way, charming city officials with donations and dismissing complaints with a patronizing smile. Liv had never had much reason to speak to her before, but now every ounce of anger she'd been suppressing boiled to the surface. "Marcia!" Liv called out, her voice cutting through the air. The woman turned slowly, her expression shifting from annoyance to mock surprise. "Liv, darling, what a coincidence. You should have told me you were coming up this way. We're just doing a little improvement project for the community." Liv stepped closer, pointing toward the trench. "You diverted the creek. That's my water, Marcia. My land is dying because of this." Marcia tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Oh, that little stream? I was told it wasn't anyone's property. It's part of the shared watershed. We've had a water use permit in progress for months, all perfectly legal. Besides, the pool's filtration system is designed to recycle most of it." "That's a lie and you know it," Liv shot back, her voice trembling. "You can't just take a natural creek and reroute it to fill your swimming pool." Marcia's lips curved into a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Liv, I understand you're upset, but you have to think about the bigger picture. The HOA has been planning to upgrade the neighborhood's recreational features for years. You're one of the few residents still holding on to old boundaries. The world's moving forward. You should try to move with it." Liv felt her hands clench at her sides. "You stole the water from my property. I'm not going to move with it. I'm going to report you." Marcia sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Report me to whom, dear?" "Everything's been approved. The HOA board signed off. The county water inspector reviewed it, and if there's a problem, it's probably with your outdated property maps. You should have come to a meeting once in a while. You might know these things. The workers avoided eye contact, pretending to focus on their equipment, though Liv could see one of them smirk when Marcia mentioned outdated maps. Her humiliation burned hotter than the sun above them. She turned and walked back down the hill, her pulse pounding in her ears. When she reached her land again, she stared at the empty bed of the creek and felt the reality of it crash over her. The earth beneath her feet was turning against her, and the person responsible was partying at the top of the hill. That evening, she watched from her porch as the glow of floodlights illuminated Marcia's estate. Laughter carried faintly through the air, music, clinking glasses, the sound of splashing water. They were celebrating, she realized, filling her stolen pool while her garden withered and her well ran dry. The injustice of it hit her so hard she had to grip the railing to steady herself. She could almost hear her father's voice whispering in disbelief. They took the creek? In the following days, Liv made calls to the county office, to the environmental department, to the local water authority. But the answers were always the same: polite indifference wrapped in bureaucratic jargon. We'll look into it. It appears to be under review. The HOA has all the necessary documentation. Each conversation left her feeling smaller, like she was shouting into a void. Even her neighbors seemed reluctant to talk. Some looked away when she passed by. Others murmured that it was better not to get involved. She began to understand that Marcia's influence stretched far beyond her manicured property lines. On the fifth night, exhausted and furious, Liv walked the length of the dry creek again. The moonlight caught on the distant shimmer of Marcia's pool, still overflowing, a cruel imitation of what had once been natural and pure. Rusty padded beside her, sniffing the parched ground. She knelt, running her hand through the cracked soil, and whispered a promise into the stillness. She would not let this stand. Whatever Marcia thought she owned, whatever power she believed protected her, Liv would find a way to expose her. The land had been hers long before the HOA's bylaws, and she would make sure it lived again, even if she had to tear down every pipe in that hill to do it. Liv didn't sleep much after that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shimmering blue of Marcia's pool, the sound of laughter echoing across the valley like an insult. The creek that had once whispered outside her window was gone, replaced by silence so deep it made her ears ache. In the morning, she woke with a sense of grim determination, the kind that settled in her bones rather than her mind. She made coffee she barely tasted, pulled her hair back, and gathered every document she could find: her property deed, the old survey maps, her father's handwritten notes about the land boundaries, even a faded letter from the county that mentioned the creek as part of her parcel. Then she drove straight to the HOA office. The building sat in the center of the development, a sterile glass box surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and flags fluttering with the association's logo. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and artificial citrus. Liv waited in line at the reception desk, clutching her folder of papers like a weapon. When her turn came, she asked to see Marcia Davenport. The receptionist, a young woman with a polished smile that looked glued in place, tilted her head sympathetically. "Mrs. Davenport is in a meeting, but I can schedule you for next Thursday." Liv's voice hardened. "Tell her it's about the creek she stole." The woman's smile faltered for half a second before she excused herself and disappeared through a frosted glass door. When Marcia finally emerged, her heels clicked against the tile like a metronome. She looked immaculate: pressed suit, pearl earrings, not a strand of hair out of place. "Liv," she said with exaggerated surprise, "I heard you were upset. Why don't we talk in my office?" Liv followed her through the corridor lined with glossy photos of landscaped gardens and smiling residents. The office itself was larger than expected, all clean lines and muted colors, the kind of place meant to project calm authority. Marcia gestured toward a chair. "Now, tell me what's troubling you." Liv spread the documents across the desk, her fingers trembling slightly but her voice steady. The creek that runs through my property has been diverted into your land. I've confirmed it with my own eyes. You had no right to do that. These papers prove the watercourse is part of my parcel, protected under the original zoning maps. Marcia leaned forward, scanning the papers briefly before smiling as if she were indulging a child's misunderstanding. I understand why you're upset, but the association's bylaws allow for the redistribution of natural resources when it benefits the community. The creek was barely a trickle for years. It made more sense to reroute it towards something useful. The new retention pond will increase local property values and create a shared space for everyone. Liv stared at her in disbelief. A shared space? You mean your pool? Marcia laughed lightly, the sound brittle. Technically, yes. It begins on my property, but it will feed into a community area once the project's complete. You should really come to our next board meeting. We'll be discussing the environmental improvements in detail. Liv slammed her hand against the table, startling even herself. You can dress it up with whatever language you want, but you stole my water. My land is dying while you play hostess. If you think I'm going to sit quietly, you don't know me at all. Marcia's expression cooled, the charm dropping away. I think you're making this unnecessarily dramatic, Liv. I've reviewed the legal side of this, and frankly, your property line is ambiguous. The association's attorneys are confident that any challenge you attempt will fail. I'd hate to see you waste money on lawyers when we could simply move forward peacefully. Liv rose to her feet, gathering her papers. You'll regret underestimating me. Marcia's smile returned, slow and poisonous. I never underestimate anyone, but I do believe some people create their own misfortune when they can't adapt to change. The next day, Liv began her own investigation. She visited the county records office, digging through dusty files and scanned maps until she found what she needed, a topographic survey from the 1970s, clearly marking the creek as part of her land's natural watershed. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, frowned as he looked over her documents. If they rerouted this without a hydrological permit, that's illegal. But HOA projects often get special exemptions. You'll have to talk to the Environmental Review Board. Liv left with copies of everything she could carry, her anger tempered by exhaustion, but not extinguished. She filed an official complaint with the board the same day, attaching photographs and her legal documents. Days turned into a week without a response. When she followed up, the clerk on the phone spoke in a cautious, measured tone. We've received your claim, Ms. Wilson, but there's already an active permit filed by the Davenport property, authorized under HOA jurisdiction. You might want to contact them directly to resolve this internally. Internally. The word tasted like ash. There was no internal recourse when the thief was the one writing the rules. That night, she returned home to find a bright yellow envelope taped to her gate. It bore the HOA seal and a warning. Notice of non-compliance, unauthorized tampering with community infrastructure. Inside was a photo of her standing near the dry creek, taken from a distance. The letter accused her of interfering with regulated drainage equipment and threatened fines if she continued. For the first time, fear crept in beneath the anger. Someone had been watching her, following her onto her own property. She looked up toward the hill where Marcia's house stood, its lights glowing like watchful eyes in the darkness. The next morning, she noticed fresh tire tracks along the boundary fence, and her mailbox had been left open, its contents damp and torn. A message was forming. Quiet, deliberate intimidation dressed as bureaucratic control. Still, Liv refused to be cowed. She began photographing everything: the trench, the equipment, the cracked soil. She even borrowed a drone from a friend to capture aerial footage showing the diverted creek line stretching from her property to Marcia's estate. Each night she backed up the footage twice, as though preparing for war. And in a way, she was. The land beneath her was drying and dying, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Marcia wanted her silence. Instead, she had awakened something else, a resolve as old as the land itself. Liv Wilson had lost her creek, but she had found her fight. By early June, the land that had once breathed with color began to resemble a graveyard. The air hung heavy with dust, and even the stubborn weeds that clung to the edges of the dried creek had surrendered to the heat. Liv had stopped painting. The blank canvas in her studio felt like a mirror reflecting her helplessness. Days bled together in a haze of paperwork, unanswered calls, and the mechanical repetition of her own voice explaining the same story to indifferent officials. She had filed reports with the county's environmental board, the water authority, even the state conservation office, but each response came back delayed or diluted with bureaucratic phrasing that meant nothing. Under review. Pending assessment. No immediate action required. It was as though the system itself had learned to mimic Marcia's smile, calm, polite, and utterly hollow. When her attorney, Jake Elson, finally agreed to take her case, it felt like the first real movement in weeks. He was a quiet man in his late 30s, with the kind of weary patience that comes from fighting losing battles against powerful clients. They met in a cafe near the courthouse, the small table between them cluttered with maps and photocopies of deeds. Jake listened without interrupting, occasionally rubbing his thumb along the edge of his coffee cup as she spoke. When she finished, he exhaled slowly and said, "What they did is almost certainly illegal, but proving it is going to be hell." Liv leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "They stole a natural watercourse. How is that not obvious?" "It's obvious morally," Jake replied, "but legally, it's murky. Water rights are complicated. If the HOA can claim the creek as part of a shared watershed, they can argue that the rerouting was for community benefit. You'll need hard evidence showing ownership and harm, real, measurable damage, environmental tests, soil analysis, aerial imagery, and even then, they'll stall it in court for years, unless we find something stronger, something that exposes deliberate misconduct." Liv pulled out the drone footage from her folder and slid it across the table. The photographs showed a clear path from her dried creek bed to the trench, cutting through Marcia's estate. In one image, a series of pipes connected directly to the basin now gleaming like a man-made lake. Jake studied the images for a long time before nodding. "This is good, but we'll need official verification. I'll contact an environmental engineer I trust. If he confirms this rerouting violated hydrological law, we'll have a case." Over the next week, Jake's contact, a quiet, meticulous man named Dr. Henry Caldwell, visited Liv's property. He spent hours walking the land with instruments, measuring water tables, taking soil samples, and marking coordinates on his tablet. When he reached the trench near the fence line, he crouched for a long time, tracing his fingers along the exposed earth. Finally, he stood and said softly, "They dug through the natural aquifer. This isn't just unethical, it's reckless. If this continues, the whole groundwater flow under this valley will collapse. I've seen this kind of thing before. It never ends well." His report came in 3 days later, and it was damning. The rerouting had disrupted the natural gradient of water distribution, lowering Liv's groundwater levels to near zero while creating artificial saturation uphill. The evidence was clear, the damage measurable, and the cause undeniable. Jake filed the documentation immediately, attaching photographs, data charts, and Caldwell's signed statement. For the first time, Liv felt a spark of vindication. The truth was on her side, but truth, she soon realized, was only half the battle. A week after the filing, she came home to find her mailbox stuffed with anonymous flyers, portraying her as a community disruptor. Someone had printed her photo, taken from a social media post, and plastered it above bold letters reading, "Water thief, stop harassing your neighbors." The HOA had begun a smear campaign, twisting the narrative so that she appeared to be the aggressor. That night, when she tried to confront one of the neighbors who had always been friendly before, the woman avoided eye contact and muttered, "It's better not to get involved, Liv. Marcia says the board is handling it." Even the small acts of comfort she'd relied on began to vanish. Someone overturned her garbage bins twice, scattering broken glass across her driveway. Rusty came home limping one morning, a small puncture wound in his paw. When she called the vet, he said the cut was clean, too clean, as though made by a sharp piece of metal deliberately placed. Liv's stomach twisted with dread, but she refused to let it break her. Instead, she bought motion sensors, set up new cameras along the property's perimeter, and began recording everything. Her days grew longer, filled with the mechanical rhythm of collecting evidence and waiting for responses that never came. Jake warned her to keep her temper, to let the law do its work, but patience was a luxury she no longer had. When the Environmental Board finally scheduled a hearing, Liv arrived with her folder thick with documents and her heart pounding so hard it felt like a drumbeat in her chest. The hearing room was small and fluorescent, with a long table where 3 officials sat flanked by their legal advisors. Across from her sat Marcia Davenport, calm and radiant as ever, dressed in pale blue with a pearl brooch pinned to her lapel. Her lawyer, a slick man with a gleaming watch, smiled at Liv like a cat about to toy with its prey. The proceedings began with polite formalities, but it didn't take long for Liv's anger to simmer beneath the surface. Marcia's lawyer spoke first, presenting the HOA's version of events, a carefully curated narrative about community enhancement and sustainable water management. He framed the rerouting as an environmental initiative, claiming the water had been diverted into a shared retention pond to reduce flooding risks and promote aesthetic cohesion within the neighborhood. Liv wanted to laugh, but her throat felt tight. When her turn came, she stood, her voice trembling only for the first few seconds before it steadied. She presented the maps, the drone photos, Caldwell's report, and the county survey. Every piece of evidence told the same story. The creek had been deliberately redirected, the natural aquifer disrupted, and her land drained to feed a private luxury. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, until Marcia leaned forward and smiled sweetly. "With all due respect," she said, "Ms. Wilson's data is incomplete. The water was already declining due to natural drought conditions, as confirmed by regional climate records. My husband and I have complied with every regulation. This is simply an unfortunate misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion." Liv's knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. "You rerouted an entire stream. That's not a misunderstanding." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They murmured among themselves before one of them, an older man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "We'll need to review the findings further before taking action. In the meantime, we recommend that both parties refrain from further modifications to the land." It was the kind of decision that meant nothing, a pause button masquerading as justice. Liv left the building shaking, the humid air outside feeling heavier than before. As she walked to her car, she caught sight of Marcia laughing softly with her lawyer near the entrance. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Marcia raised her phone, as if taking a picture, and said in a tone that carried effortlessly through the parking lot, "Don't worry, dear. Everything will work itself out. It always does." That night, Liv sat on her porch long after the sun had gone, the darkness pressing close around her. The creek bed glimmered faintly in the moonlight, dry as bone, a scar carved across the land she loved. She opened her father's old journal, its pages yellowed with age, and found a note he had written years ago. "The earth remembers every wound. Sooner or later, it demands balance." She read it over and over until the words began to feel like a warning and a promise. Marcia Davenport had awakened something deeper than greed or law. She had broken the balance of the land itself. And Liv, who had spent her life listening to the rhythm of water and soil, understood now that she could no longer rely on anyone else to restore it. The fight had shifted. This was no longer about property or paperwork. It was about survival. The weeks following the hearing were a slow descent into something darker than frustration, a kind of suffocating awareness that the fight had moved beyond the courtroom, that whatever rules Liv thought governed fairness no longer applied here. It began subtly, the way most orchestrated cruelties do, with whispers and shadows that could almost be dismissed as coincidence. The postman began leaving her mail in a plastic bin at the edge of the road instead of her box, claiming someone had complained about her dog being aggressive, though Rusty barely barked at strangers. Her trash collection stopped without notice, and when she called the waste service, they informed her the HOA had requested a temporary suspension due to noncompliance. Within days, bags piled up beside her fence, attracting flies in the summer heat. It was as though her life was being systematically dismantled, one small inconvenience at a time. The neighbors who once waved politely now turned away when she passed. A few even crossed the street to avoid her, pretending to be on the phone. One morning she found a note wedged under her windshield wiper, written in neat block letters. "Enough is enough. Stop making trouble." She crumpled it in her fist, but the words clung to her like a stain. The same afternoon, she saw Marcia in her yard, standing near the pool with a group of HOA members, pointing toward Liv's property as if giving a tour of some cautionary tale. The sight sent a rush of heat up Liv's spine, a mix of rage and disbelief. Jake called her later that week with bad news. "The HOA has filed a counterclaim," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "They're accusing you of violating community ordinances, claiming your irrigation setup is diverting water from the communal drainage. It's absurd, but it's enough to drag this out further." Liv closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples. "They're trying to bury me in paperwork." Jake hesitated. "That's their strategy. They're betting you'll run out of money or patience first." She almost laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "They don't know me very well then." She started documenting everything with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every letter, every incident, every strange car parked near her driveway went into a folder. Her camera captured the dry creek bed from every angle, the cracks widening as the weeks dragged on. The drone footage showed the pool above her property growing fuller, the soil around it slick and dark with oversaturation. Her evidence was irrefutable, but evidence didn't matter when the opposition controlled the narrative. The HOA newsletter released a statement calling her an uncooperative resident whose actions threaten community harmony. The phrasing was perfect, vague enough to sound reasonable, but sharp enough to brand her as an outcast. The final straw came one humid evening when Liv returned from town to find her garden torn apart. The flower beds were trampled, the irrigation lines slashed open, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline. A single wooden stake had been hammered into the ground near her porch, with a laminated notice stapled to it. "Stop trespassing on HOA project property. Violators will be prosecuted." It bore the HOA letterhead and Marcia's signature at the bottom. Liv stood there for a long time, her breath coming in shallow bursts, the sun sinking behind her in a haze of orange and smoke. Something inside her snapped, not in panic, but in clarity. They wanted her afraid. They wanted her gone. But she wasn't going anywhere. That night she wrote a detailed statement for the police, attaching photographs of the vandalism and the threatening notice. When the officer arrived, a young man who seemed barely out of training, he walked the perimeter of her property with an expression that hovered between discomfort and indifference. "There's no clear evidence linking this to anyone specific," he said finally, tucking his notepad into his pocket. "Could be local kids, could be animals." Liv's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Animals that can type and sign legal notices." He shifted uneasily, then sighed. "Look, Ms. Wilson, off the record, the HOA here has pull. I'd be careful about making accusations without proof. It might make things harder for you." When he left, the silence that settled over her land felt different, thicker, heavier, like a blanket meant to smother rather than comfort. The next day, her attorney informed her that the HOA's legal team had escalated their complaint. They were now accusing her of defamation and harassment, citing her public allegations as damaging to the association's reputation. Jake's voice over the phone was grim. "They're going for character assassination now. It's not just about water anymore. It's about making you look unstable. Liv stood by her window as he spoke, staring at the hill where Marcia's property shimmered under the sun. Then we make them look afraid, she said quietly. Because they are. She launched her own counterattack, not in court, but in public. She uploaded the drone footage to social media, pairing it with before and after photos of her creek and the basin feeding Marcia's pool. Within hours, the post began circulating among local environmental groups. Reporters started calling. The next evening, a small news crew showed up at her gate. Liv, exhausted and trembling but resolute, told her story on camera. How the HOA had drained her land under the guise of community development. How her complaints were buried beneath bureaucracy. How one woman's greed had turned an entire neighborhood complicit. When the segment aired, it caught fire online. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others skeptical, but the exposure changed something. For the first time, Marcia's pristine reputation began to crack. The following morning, Liv woke to find 2 SUVs parked across the road. 3 men in plain clothes stood near the trench, pretending to inspect it. When she approached, one of them looked up and smiled thinly. "Routine maintenance," he said, his tone deliberately casual. Liv didn't reply. She simply took out her phone and started recording. The man's smile faded, and within minutes they packed up and left. She stood there long after the engines had faded, clutching her phone like a shield. That night, heavy rain finally came, the first in months. But instead of soaking into the ground, the water rushed downhill along the carved trench, bypassing her land entirely. She stood in the doorway, watching sheets of rain batter the empty creek bed, the runoff roaring past her fence toward the hill where lights shimmered in Marcia's backyard. The sound was deafening, almost mocking. Rusty pressed against her leg, trembling at the thunder, and Liv whispered into the storm, her voice steady and defiant. "You can drown the earth in lies, Marcia, but it still knows where it belongs." For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the dark or the silence. Both had become part of her, sharpening her resolve. The HOA could isolate her, smear her, threaten her, but they couldn't change the truth. The water that once gave her land life had been stolen, and now that theft was visible to the world, the next move would be hers. The lawsuit reached its breaking point on a scorching August morning when the county courthouse filled with restless energy and the air inside the courtroom felt heavier than the heat outside. Liv sat beside Jake, her palms damp against the polished wood of the plaintiff's table, the weight of months of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. Across the aisle, Marcia Davenport looked untouched by it all, flawless as ever, her pearl earrings gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights, her lips curved in that faintly amused smile that had haunted Liv since the first day she watched the creek die. The room buzzed with murmurs from local reporters and neighbors drawn by curiosity and gossip, the story of the HOA water war having turned into a small-town spectacle. Jake rose first, his voice calm, but carrying an edge honed by weeks of preparation. He laid out the evidence with deliberate precision, the drone footage tracing the diverted creek line, the expert report from Dr. Caldwell proving the destruction of the aquifer, the original topographic maps from county archives showing the watercourse as part of Liv's property, the photographs of Marcia's pool overflowing while the valley below cracked open in drought. As each exhibit was projected on the screen, Liv felt a pulse of vindication, faint but real, ripple through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, their whispers softening as the facts spoke for themselves. When Marcia's attorney stood to respond, his tone was practiced, smooth as silk, but empty of conviction. He spoke of community initiatives, mutual benefit, and miscommunication between property owners. He waved off the environmental damage as a result of natural seasonal fluctuations, insisting that Marcia had acted within the HOA's authority and that Liv's claims were nothing more than a personal grudge inflated by online attention. But his confidence wavered when Jake interrupted with a document newly obtained from county records, a permit filed under Marcia's name, forged with a falsified approval signature. The courtroom went still. Even Marcia's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, and in that flicker, Liv saw the truth. Beneath all her poise, there was panic. The judge leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mrs. Davenport, can you explain why this document bears the signature of an official who retired 2 years before its date of issue?" The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Marcia's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she straightened in her seat, her tone still honeyed, though her eyes had hardened. "I can't speak to clerical errors, Your Honor. I trusted the HOA's contractors to manage all paperwork properly." The lie hung in the air like smoke, acrid and transparent. Jake handed over a second document. Emails between Marcia and a private contractor discussing the fast-tracked rerouting project and promising a quiet signature in exchange for a donation to the HOA's recreation fund. By the time the evidence was done, the facade had cracked completely. Marcia's calm had turned brittle. Her gaze darted between the judge and her attorney as if searching for a way out. Liv watched her, feeling something unexpected. Pity, brief and bitter, for the woman who had traded integrity for vanity. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was grave. "This court finds sufficient evidence of willful misconduct, falsification of documents, and unauthorized alteration of a natural watercourse. The HOA's permit is hereby invalidated, and the defendant is ordered to restore the original flow under county supervision. Damages will be assessed to compensate the plaintiff for environmental and personal losses." The gavel struck, and for a moment Liv didn't breathe. The sound reverberated through her chest like thunder breaking after a long drought. Around her, voices rose, reporters murmuring, neighbors whispering, Jake exhaling with quiet relief. But Liv heard none of it. All she could see was the image of the creek, her creek, coming back to life in her mind's eye, water rushing once more through the cracks, washing the dust from the stones. Marcia left the courtroom without looking at her, her lawyer trailing behind, the mask of composure slipping just enough to reveal the fury underneath. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, lighter, as though the world itself had exhaled. Jake rested a hand on Liv's shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. She shook her head, the corner of her mouth lifting in a faint smile. "No," she murmured. "The land did. It just needed someone to speak for it." That evening, as she drove back home, the hills glowed with the late summer sun, the air still humming from the storm of victory. She parked by the gate, stepped out, and walked to the edge of the dry creek. For a long time she stood there listening. Then, somewhere beneath the soil, she heard it, the faintest whisper of movement, like a sigh from the earth itself. A single trickle of water slid between the stones, catching the light before disappearing again. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough. The land was remembering, and so was she. Autumn arrived slowly, as if the valley itself needed time to heal. The rains returned first, gentle at the beginning, soft enough to soak into the thirsty soil, then steadier, carving the faint lines of the creek once more into the earth. Liv would stand by the window each morning, watching the water reclaim its path, darkening the stones that had lain pale and lifeless for months. The sound was different now, quieter but deeper, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost and everything she had fought to restore. The garden began to breathe again, color seeping back into the leaves and flowers as though drawn by invisible threads of memory. Rusty spent hours lying by the bank, his paws muddy, his tail twitching at the ripples. Marcia Davenport's house stood silent on the hill, the pool drained, the fountain dry, its tiles cracking under the first frost. The HOA board had voted her out within weeks of the verdict, their voices suddenly full of moral outrage, as if they hadn't once toasted beside her shimmering water. Rumor had it she was selling the property, unable to face the whispers that now followed her name. Liv didn't celebrate her fall. She had no energy left for vengeance. The earth had already passed its own judgment, stripping the hill of its stolen brightness and returning balance in its slow, unyielding way. The settlement funds arrived in late October. Jake urged her to use part of it to repair the house, but instead she rebuilt the old water channel, reinforcing it with stones carved from the hillside, shaping it by hand until it felt alive again. When the creek finally ran strong enough to fill her basin, she painted for the first time in almost a year. The canvas showed no people, no houses, only water flowing through broken land, glinting with sunlight that looked like forgiveness. One evening she hosted a small gathering for her few remaining neighbors, those who had quietly supported her when it mattered. They stood together under the fading light, glasses raised as the sound of running water filled the valley. Liv didn't give a speech. She simply smiled, the weight of months lifting like mist. When the others left and the night grew still, she lingered by the creek, its surface reflecting the stars. Her father's words came back to her, softer than memory. As long as the creek runs, the land will live. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of wet earth and autumn leaves, and for the first time in a long while, she felt whole again.